Both making it through the weather. Stephen, might you introduce yourself and then Tony, and then I'll begin, as we're slightly short of people so far.
Yes, so I'm Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute. So we're a national charity that does research and development and policy work in learning, skills and employment.
Tony?
I'm Tony Wilson. I'm the Director at the Institute for Employment Studies. Similarly, we're an independent research centre that delivers research and consultancy in issues related to employment, HR and the labour market.
Thank you. Is there anybody against in-work progression?
I'd be surprised if there was
Some of us against it.
I mean, I think in general, it depends a bit what you mean by progression and how you get there, which I think the devil's in the detail. I guess, I'm sure we'll get into lots of that. I guess the other point I would make as well is it has to be progression or a work opportunity that suits people and their circumstances as well. And I think that's one of the issues with the structure of the labour market, for example, about the number of flexible working opportunities higher up the earnings scale, and if progression means you lose access to some of those, then that would not be good for certain individuals.
I come from a world where people didn't change their jobs, they kept jobs, exactly the same jobs for life, but they saw their children making the progression they never had. Now, nobody thought my dad was bad because he turned out for 48 years and did the same job in a factory. Whereas now, he would be cast as a villain. Is that fair?
Well, no, it wouldn't be fair to cast him as a villain. And I think actually that reflects some pretty fundamental changes in how the labour market and how the economy works now compared with 30 or 40 years ago. And this point about would some people object to progression, I would say there'd be some employers and some workers who'd be decidedly ambivalent about progression. And the big differences that we've seen over the last 30 years, for example, around the hollowing out of some of those middle roles, some of those have been lost through computerisation and advances in technology, some have been lost through globalisation and outsourcing. And that's meant that the ability to stay in a firm and expect to progress has been reduced, but also there's been changes in the power balance between workers and managers, for example, which has meant that we've seen many employers adopting, and there's good research on this, adopting HR models which are around kind of cost reduction and around kind of core and periphery models, so where they have a smaller number of permanent staff and rely more on temporary workforce to meet short-term needs, and where actually labour is relatively cheap, and when you create then potentially a kind of a low-skill, low-pay cycle, there's relatively little incentive for employers to invest in developing their staff. So a lot of the debate then about in-work progression becomes framed around how can we support people to progress through the external labour market by leaving one job and finding another one, rather than how can we address these really impossibly difficult structural challenges about creating better internal progression routes so that it's viable to say you will stay in the factory, or indeed for that matter, in the modern economy, the warehousing operation, the distribution centre, and expect to be able to progress.
My dad was left alone by the labour exchange because there weren't any benefits to draw. He would now be harassed because he'd qualify for benefits. And although we talk about this as terms of labour progression and all, which sounds all very good, and it in itself is very good, it is also about saving money, isn't it?
But it is. But the reason for that is that those benefits have been introduced to address a challenge around working poverty. So your dad probably wouldn't have been living in poverty as it's defined now, but earning a decent wage. Yeah. But what has definitely changed now is, as we know, has been the growth of working poverty, and then the introduction of a benefit system 20 years ago to try to address working poverty, and then a concern that then we need to reduce costs of that benefit system and expect employers to take more of the strain through wages, which hasn't happened in the last decade. And as a consequence now, we're saying let's reduce costs through incentives, through sanctions, through conditionality, through trying to better support progression out of low pay. So the benefit system was introduced to deal with the problem about how the labour market has changed and how and how the economy has changed. And now we're trying to address the problem. It's this iron rule that we can't address poverty, unemployment, and have a low-cost system at the same time.
Stephen, isn't it misleading to say this all about trying to address poverty? Because George Osborne made, I think, one of the most important welfare reforms ever by making the minimum wage so much more effective than it's ever been. We now have a minimum wage which is way out of kilter with other countries, and it may be one of the consequences of that is not unemployment, as every economist told it would be, but in this flexible labour market, which is nil hours contracts and all the rest of it, that people are going to try and abide by the law, but they're also going to try and protect their position as employers, not for the minimum wage to bring the company down with them. And we know there's old rogues like Uber and all the rest of it exploiting that. But do you see the labour market in those terms? That Tony was talking about we're dealing with poverty, but George Osborne's measure has been the single most important measure in dealing with poverty from when I can remember.
Yeah, I think the Chancellor's commissioned a review to look at what should happen to the minimum wage after 2020 as well, with a view to pushing it higher as a proportion of average earnings as well.
He wants to do so, doesn't he?
He does, yes. And it used to be the debate was if you do that, that's going to cost jobs. And then certainly as far as we've pushed it so far, it's not cost large numbers of jobs. The question is, do the effects concertina out in other ways, which is what you're asking. So what we're aiming for is this virtuous circle where you raise wages, employers, because staff cost more, they invest more, and we get higher productivity, and we get this virtuous circle. The risk is, as Tony was saying, you get more of a vicious circle, and those terms and conditions change, or the external and internal labour markets that Tony was talking about.
Was that given the minimum wage has had a tremendously good effect in putting in this floor, it might have changed the structure, if I can call it, using that word, which is a catch-all phrase, isn't it? The bottom end of the labour market, in that there has been this real growth in nil hours and other flexible working practice. Now, given that everybody should be on the minimum wage, and it's quite hard to keep a job in these circumstances, why should DWP harass them into going up the greasy pole?
Well, I think this is a really important point, because if the focus on in-work progression becomes effectively a claimant management programme by Job Centre Plus for a new category of claimants that have come through the creation of tax credits and now universal credit, then I think that's doomed to failure, and it blames individuals for being on low pay, whereas actually I would argue it needs to be a much broader strategy about how you change the labour market, and putting the minimum wage together with working with employers to structure work, boosting investment, and doing a whole bunch of other stuff, and a more engaging offer to individuals if they want it. But if they don't want it, or it doesn't suit their circumstances, they should be earning enough to have a decent standard of living and a decent quality of life.
Do you want to add to that before I go on?
No, I very much agree, and I agree with your point. I mean, the minimum wage has and the living wage, I should say, has made a significant difference to the incomes of those paid families. There is a bit of sort of strategic confusion or ambiguity, if we're being sort of charitable, in terms of what the department is trying to achieve, in terms of that broader policy objective in developing conditionality and support for people in low pay. But I think one of the fundamental challenges is that if we're interested in poverty, then that's a household phenomenon, and so it depends on how many people in the household work, the hours that they work, and the characteristics of that household. So although the national living wage has risen, it's nudging the level of the official living wage now. It's not far off the sort of £9 an hour of the official living wage. For many families, that still wouldn't be enough to lift them out of poverty. So there's still a challenge there. But the other reasons why we do this is definitely around that economic case about trying to raise productivity, address underutilisation and potential. And sorry, Chair.
Doesn't minimum wage have another effect on the status of workers?
Yeah.
In that previously you got your status that you could stand up to your employer if need be through your trade union. Now trade unions have been massively weakened. And in the current circumstances, at least you think I'm screwing out of them a more decent minimum than I would ever have got before. And I think that's very important for people to feel that everything else has got a price on. I've got a price on my head, and this is what I think I should be getting if I'm working.
That's right. And the minimum wage, the national living wage, has become the going rate, not just in many sectors or occupations, it's become the going rate in many parts of the country. So outside of London and towards the north of England and parts of the Midlands, the going rate is the national living wage. There's very little scope to negotiate. But there is still scope to negotiate over things like employment terms, over permanent and use of permanent and temporary work, and over the wider employment package. And so in particular, your points about 0 hours and temporary work, those have definitely grown. They've fallen back actually in the last couple of years. But what we have seen is a lot more variation in the hours that people work, and that's continued. And some of the more innovative and interesting stuff where employers in low-paying sectors that do progress their staff have taken action has been around things like offering more guaranteed hours and introducing one-way flexibility for the individual to be able to say, I would like to increase my hours. And we've come across examples of this, and work we've done is quite well evidenced in research too. And that's where I think there is much more scope for either collective or at an individual level bargaining and negotiation.
Tony, I want to come on to that, and then I'll bring Nigel in, if I may. I mean, given that I started out being hostile with my questions, that was merely because I wanted to play devil's advocate. I mean, of course, work progression could be a very, very, very good thing. So might you tell us from your experience, what are the best ways of encouraging that without beating up claimants?
Well, certainly the last time I gave evidence on this was 3 years ago, and I was looking back over that actually, and it's a shame that the evidence base hasn't progressed that much in the last few years. But I do think we're getting more solid in being able to identify some of those factors that are important for work that Learning Work has done, that I was involved with at the time, and in the DWP's research as well. And so there's a few things I think. One is about how we engage effectively with people. Many people in low pay don't want to progress, often for very good reason, because of the quality of work, their experience of work, the stress of work, the hours they work, but also because of other things in their lives, family in particular. How we brand and message and engage with people about progressing on their terms, and some of that will be horizontal rather than vertical. That will be about accessing skills at work and changing jobs and getting more security. It might involve reducing your pay in the short term before getting more pay. So there's a point about how we can engage more effectively, some really good evidence on that, and a lot of that involves working through partners as well, I think. Everything that I think has pointed to, over decades actually, has pointed to the centrality of the work coach or the advisor relationship. And that's more complicated and involved than it is for many out-of-work claimants. So, because firstly, you've got to be far more flexible in how you work, to be able to do it around people's working lives, in the evening, at weekends, around their hours and so on. You need to be really good at understanding how the world of work works, so the opportunities for internal progression but also external progression. You need to be able to do the things that a good work coach should be able to do anyway, in terms of profile, working with the individual, working on their strengths, their assets, their profile, identifying scope to progress. You need also to be able to work more in the internal labour market space with employers potentially.
But isn't that a point you made, a key one, that why many low-paid workers wouldn't want to move, is that my mum and dad went out to work so they could feed their kids. And if I was a part-time or even a full-time worker and had found a job which allowed me to pull the wage packet in and look after what I think are my family responsibilities, I would be loath to be called to the job centre for some quizzing about shouldn't you be thinking about another job. I'd think these people don't know the world we live in if they're asking me to leave a safe harbour when I can actually keep. We're not homeless, and we're not hungry, and all these other key things which other families fail. And somebody wants to come along and rough me up because I'm not going up the progression. But the question I asked you was, supposing people do, both Tony and Stephen, what are the things which help that most? We all know what the stick will be. Sanctions. But what are the carrots, please?
Individual, so working with an individual. So I think the evidence so far suggests that the biggest opportunities are around supporting people to find a better job somewhere else. I preface that by saying I think the best evidence is from voluntary engagement. I think your point's exactly right, but the starting point shouldn't be to bring people in and harass them. And I do think in the DWP research, which I can come back to, there's some slightly worrying evidence that people's well-being deteriorates with the greater the intensity of engagement they get from Job Centre Plus, and without clear benefits.
So your recommendation to us to make would be, it's a good idea, but ask the volunteers first.
I would say,
rather than actually make it a compulsory part of the contract.
So I would say we've done the compulsion bit with the randomised controlled trial. It was relatively light touch intervention, but it was based on a requirement to attend, and then mostly kind of voluntary support. But there was quite a worryingly high instance of sanctions for the frequent group in particular. So I'd say we've done that to a large extent. The evidence around voluntary engagement through the Employment Retention Advancement Project a decade ago, through Work Advance in the US and through some of the other work that Learning Work and others have done, I think is where there's more opportunities, where it's more promising to look at. But that voluntary shouldn't mean sitting back and waiting for people to turn up. It should be about how we work through partners and in communities to engage with groups that are likely to be disadvantaged or likely to benefit from progression, and framing it. So it's not just about, do you want to earn 50p an hour more and have more stress in your life, but about how can we help you to address, how can we help you to achieve more, to do more, to earn more, to have more status, to feel better about work. And often that means finding a better job.
Do you think that could ever happen in today's job centre, given the pressure the workers are under?
So right now I think it would be a challenge. I'm completely agnostic about whether this is delivered by sort of public servants, by private sector providers, by voluntary and community sector, because I think Job Centre Plus has done this sort of stuff really well in the past, through New Deal for Lone Parents, through ERAD itself, the Employment Retention Pilot a decade ago, through any number of interventions. That cadre of work coaches, I think, is well capable of doing it. They need the freedom to be able to do it.
Can I?
Stephen, the thing of me having a free roam with the question, where it means I've been pinching other people's questions, so I apologise. But Nigel, what do you want to salvage on what I've left you?
Let's ask a couple of questions. I suppose there are different cohorts here, so there are. Would you agree it would be a bit of a strange system to take somebody who have been working full time, to get them a 16-hour-a-week job, and then just boot them out the door of the job centre, say that's our role done? Actually, there is quite a bit of logic to say we think our role is to get you back into full-time work, so this is kind of a halfway there, but we'll keep supporting you until we've got you all the way there. That counts as in work progression then, doesn't it, getting them the extra hours back to full-time?
I think we're sort of the question about what we mean by progression comes in here a little bit, I think, as well. So if you're working in the labour market, you should be earning enough to have a good standard of living to be rewarded for the work that you do. So that's a question about where the minimum wage sits, and also what stuff happens around that as well. But if you want to get on, or if there's scope for you to do so, you should have the support for you to do so as well. I think the question is, it goes back to one of the chair's points earlier as well, is about how you do that. And I do agree with Tony, if this becomes, or agree and slightly disagree as well actually, if this becomes a Job Centre Plus programme that basically treats people as though it's your fault that you're low paid or you're in part-time work, but it may or may not suit you. Maybe it suits your circumstances. It does for some people, and therefore we're going to hit you with some sticks until you do better. I think the engagement point is really important. So if I give just one brief example, we evaluated a programme in West London where they wrote out to all their in-work housing benefit claimants and said, are you interested in getting some help to earn more, or to get a job that suits you better, or to fit things around your life a bit better? And they got really high take-up of that. People came forward, and they then gave them all the advisor support and the tailored support Tony was talking about. So I think it's about how you engage people.
Was that a housing association did that, not the job centre?
It was the local authorities, yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And there's a couple of examples of that, and it just proved to be a more engaging way, I think, of getting people interested in the first place, rather than being potentially worried that they're being called in by the job centre, or feeling that it's a message to them that they haven't done, quote unquote, the right thing.
Nigel, on that Do you think it was because everybody knew the local authority couldn't sanction them?
It's not possible to say definitively from the research and the studies. I guess because we spoke to a number of people who took part in that programme, and I think it was that the local authority was trusted, and that they kind of it may be that they weren't worried about being sanctioned. It may be that they felt the local authority was involved in lots of other things and was there to help them rather than what's in it for you. That you might get from some others. Same applies to housing associations elsewhere as well, and some community groups. So I think you could have this network of engagement organisations across the public and voluntary and community sectors that could get people interested in that support, and they're more likely to get a result out of it if they're interested than if they're forced to do it, I think.
Yes, but the question I was asking was one level of in-work progression is to get someone to progress from 16 hours to 35, and I was wondering whether you agreed that actually that was probably an easier thing to agree. The department actually had a very real interest in supporting people who could work full-time to actually get a full-time job rather than stick at a part-time one. I mean, that just seems fair and sensible, that you wouldn't stop the support when they get half the hours they need. You keep engaged until at least they've got the full-time job, or 2 part-time jobs presumably, or whatever they need.
And the promise of universal credit is in part that work coaches will have more of the flexibility to do that in a more supportive way. So they would have, so this is quite apart from issues around conditionality, but they would have mixed caseloads where they might be supporting some people who are unemployed and ready and able to work, some people who are more disadvantaged, and some people who are in work and low paid. And there'd be the scope to, as you support people from that ready and able to work into employment group, to maintain that contact and that support, and then help them think about their next job, their next opportunity, how to take on more hours. So the promise of that, I think, is should be recognised, and we should encourage the department to do that. And the investment they're making in work coaching, I think, is really welcome. The NAO highlighted this in their disability employment report too. The challenges, though, are pretty significant, and in the work, the work programme was built on this model in part as well, about maintaining employment and providing in-work support. And consistently, that was really challenging. Once people have been out of work for a long time, get into work, often the last thing they want to do is to speak to their advisor and maintain contact with the benefits system. They also are trying to manage a job. They're trying to manage the day-to-day pressures of work and that transition in particular. So I think there's better evidence around that into work, and then managing the immediate sort of how you stay in work, maintain that more regular engagement, thinking that, and we found this actually in the Step Up project as well, where some of those models in the Step Up pilots that ran in London were based on recontacting people who'd been helped into work a year previously, for example. It was really hard. Picking the phone up to somebody you've not spoken to for a year and saying, "I helped you get a job, can I help you find the next one?" They don't. It doesn't happen. So I think there's definitely the potential to do that, and we should try to encourage it. We should welcome it, and we should. And that's a good area actually for thinking about future investment too. Things we can trial and test.
In comparison to how we treat people who are self-employed, who try and become self-employed when they've been unemployed, in that we now set a minimum income floor in effect to say, actually, until you're earning this much, we're going to keep imposing requirements on you. I mean, there's kind of the same feeling about that as this, isn't there? That until you're earning over your, what is it, £338 a month or whatever, actually we're going to keep some pretty intensive engagement with you, and then once you're over that, then we can be more sort of cuddly-feely rather than sticks.
Bit of sort of ambiguity or confusion about what the objective is. So for the self-employed, that's a really it's really hard. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a really hard test. And if you fall the wrong side of it, as many do, you lose out significantly. And the rationale for that is that concerns about unproductive work, potentially abuse of the system, and wanting to reduce expenditure on social security. In this space, the government don't frame it in those terms around in-work progression, but there are these different groups. So there's the people below the administrative earnings threshold, who if you like, are typically working fewer than a couple of days a week, where the department is basically saying you're not working enough. You're not working enough for us to feel like we should be, we shouldn't continue to be on your case and trying to get you to work more. But then there's another group below the conditionality earnings threshold, And actually, it's very complicated when couple households where one works and one doesn't. Where you know, what is the rationale for intervention there? Is it that we think that people are being lazy, that we think there's abuse, that we think it's a patrician motivation to alleviate poverty, that we should be, you know, it's an economic or a social motivation? And there's a bit of ambiguity there, and I very much hope that it's, you know, and sort of, as I said earlier, one would hope it would be around trying to support progression for those who are ready and want to progress. And then delivering the right sort of support to enable that.
So you touched on the trial the department did, which had the 3 levels of engagement, and I think the most intense engagement achieved average earnings of £5.25 more a week, and the moderate support got £4.43 more a week. So not huge differences really. Between limited engagement and very intensive.
Yeah, I think this is, if you do the sort of thing that was done in that trial, you will get some small positive change, including for the sort of people you were talking about where they're working part-time and could be working full-time because they don't have a set of caring commitments, for example, so small increases in hours. But I would say that it does come back to Tony's point about what's the objective of the policy. So if it is to reduce benefit expenditure on in-work benefits, then doing that sort of thing that the DWP did will make some small difference, and I don't think it was balanced against the costs, so we don't quite know whether the costs stacked up against the savings. But I would say we should be looking at a broader ambition about how the labour market works for people, and therefore you need a much more joined-up offer across a range of different public services and working with employers as well, rather than, you know, this might be, it's a bit like going out on the golf course with just a putter. You know, you'll be okay for some of the shots, but I would say we need a much broader ambition, and so this might be the putter, but we need some of the other clubs as well.
Yeah, so the trial found what I think many people would have predicted, and actually in the inquiry sort of 3 years ago, I mean, you know, certainly the evidence we gave at the time was sort of along those lines. It was a very modest trial. It was testing really the application of the conditionality and support regime that exists for out-of-work claimants for the in-work group. We know that has a small positive effect on the likelihood of people out of work finding work. We did predict and said, you know, this is likely to have a small positive effect, and it did. Important things here, though, there wasn't really much difference between the frequent and moderate group. Certainly wouldn't be enough to pass a sort of treasury test of let's go for frequent rather than moderate. The frequent group had 20-odd interventions over a year, and earnings increased by £5. The moderate group had, on average, just under 10 interventions a year, and earnings increased by £4.40, I think. So these are not going to be large enough differences to pass that sort of cost-benefit analysis. But underneath that, there's some quite worrying stuff too. So attitudes to progression didn't really change between the groups. So the frequency of support didn't lead to any change in attitudes, actually, around progression. And the lots of qualitative research pointed to particular issues around...
Changing attitude by the claimant or by the officer?
By the claimant. So people saying that they want to progress, or they feel that progression is important for them, for example. Wellbeing scores, I mentioned earlier, for the frequent group fell, and the only group for whom they did fall. So people actually reported, and actually the wellbeing scores rose slightly for the non-intervention group. And that may well be a consequence of, that could be a consequence of the hassle of engagement with Job Centre Plus, or it could actually be wellbeing feeling lower because actually having put yourself forward to progress and realise how difficult it is, that can be quite dispiriting if you're not then getting the support around that. But we did also see, there was also some positive findings in the research. People in the more frequent group more likely to access training, for example. They reported fewer barriers in the subsequent wave of the findings from the earlier one. So it's really mixed views, and I think it kind of, and it would be, I imagine it would have been quite frustrating actually to having commissioned this large-scale trial, found some quite small positive effects, enough to probably justify doing something, but not enough really underneath that to be confident about what's driving what's driving outcomes, what's causing people to seek more support, what's affecting their likelihood of wanting to progress, what affects motivation and behaviours, and what should we do more of, what should we invest more in.
What would be the measures of what success would look like for this policy? What should the department try and find out, and what data would it need to actually prove that? I mean, I assume at a certain level you could just track claimants and see whether their earnings are going up by more than inflation and decide that that's a sign that things are going well, or if they're not, you could decide that things weren't going so well. I mean, is that all you'd really need, or is there Is there more information you want?
I mean, I would say you need to look at earnings, but earnings means a range of things underneath that. So is it people's hourly earnings, so they're going up the ladder, or is it their total income, which could be because their hourly rate's gone up or because they're working more hours? Also the household income and impacts on child poverty, because who are the people who are getting that small amount of progression from that trial that we were talking about a moment ago. So there's a number of things underneath even the income point or earnings point. And then there's other points about people's well-being, people's skill levels, people's shifts from a temporary to permanent work, if that's what people want to do. So what do people mean by progression? All of those things I think you would need to look at for it not to just be a benefit spend reduction programme, but actually be a more engaging programme that's meant to be there for citizens.
And I think that's absolutely right, and sort of echo all of those points about how we sort of measure the effectiveness of the intervention, if you like, or the delivery of the intervention and managed performance. There is a wider point about how we measure then the broader outcomes we're trying to achieve, and this is what worries me a bit, is that we don't have, comes back to this point, we don't really have a good framework for thinking about this in. So should we be trying to measure changes in poverty that could be a consequence of more effective intervention? Should we be trying to measure the contribution that makes to raising productivity in areas or within firms? Is there measures of underutilisation we could use? And I think it's a really important point. The Employer Skills Survey is reporting growing levels of and there's over as well, but underutilisation of workers. So that's an economic issue, but it's also it's a social one about people achieving their potential. There's a wider set of evaluation objectives, which we don't really get into in a lot of the evaluations so far. But that needs to be the start as well, the sort of starting point about why we're doing this, why we're trying to intervene.
Maybe my memory is a bit hazy of when we introduced UC, but there was a great selling point, which was it'll make absolutely clear that work will pay, and if you earn more, you'll keep more, and everyone will be far better off, and those incentives will be hugely beneficial in the system in helping people and in saving money for the benefit system. And isn't there quite a simple way of measuring whether that's true or not, in that you should be able to sort of see whether people, having joined UC, actually are so believing they can keep more if they work more, that they are actually A, trying to work more, and B, trying to work better. I mean, presumably you could see data which showed you that at least.
In terms of people's attitudes and behaviours, so these are sort of really important evaluation questions for universal credit, and we should see more of that in the coming years. I mean, the universal credit research on this so far has been quite mixed. So it goes back a bit now, but a few years ago DWP research suggesting that claimants of UC were more likely to want to increase their hours and earnings, but that in practice most of the impacts seem to be in people working shorter numbers of hours. So taking advantage of the fact there was no longer that cliff edge to work 3, 4, 5 hours a week rather than the sort of 16, 20, 24 hours. So there is a point there about how we measure whether people believe in universal credit. But a lot of the claimant research suggests that people just don't understand the benefits, and that's inevitable because universal credit is very simple. It looks simple if you're sitting in Whitehall looking at the sheets and looking at the withdrawal rates. It's a far more complicated benefit for people now than the benefits it's replaced, because of the way things like monthly assessment works, the monthly payment works, and the interaction of the different elements of the benefit and the single and that being disguised in a single payment. People don't understand how their payment's been constituted and what's driving increases and reductions. So you get, for example, and this happened in the in-work progression trial, a much higher proportion of claimants saying they've had their benefit stopped during the trial than are actually coming up through sanctions figures, because people just don't understand why and how their benefit changes month to month.
All right, Chris? Yes, thanks. Gentlemen, we turn now to the role of sanctions. Is there any evidence at all that conditionality and sanctions are effective in encouraging claimants to increase their hours or pay? Is there any evidence out there?
Not that I've seen. Not that I've seen.
That's a good answer. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that...
Expand on that.
It's such a clear thing for our report statement.
Yes, I agree. The DWP trial showed some small positive increases in earnings, but we don't know if that's because of the threat of sanctions or just the engagement or lots of other things. And the research we've done says that voluntary engagement and going out there and engaging and persuading people is much more effective.
No evidence, but you were going to qualify it.
No, I wasn't actually. I wasn't going to qualify it. I was going to say a couple of things. So one is that I think DWP probably believes there's no evidence as well, because if you look at the trend in sanctioning of people who are in work under universal credit, it's fallen consistently since 2017. It's around 1 in 200 in working claimants are sanctioned now in any given month. And if you go back to March 17, it was about 1 in 25. If you go back a year or so before that, it was as high as 1 in 20. So if there was some amazing evidence that sanctions worked, you wouldn't expect to see it falling from 4 or 5% of the monthly caseload to about 0.4% of the caseload. And when you look at why people are sanctioned in the DWP research, it seems fairly clear why that would be the case. Like 90-odd% of the sanctions were for failing to attend an interview. So it's hard to see how that's getting anywhere near behaviour change or a kind of a something for something approach to trying to support people to progress in work. These are people having their benefits stopped because they didn't turn up to an interview. These are working people who failed to attend an interview, probably because it wasn't convenient or something else came up, and lost their benefit. So it's hard to see that sanctions would have been driving changes in performance. And our own research, we've done a lot of research around sanctions for people out of work, and the DWP qualitative research for the in-work progression trial suggests that the negative impact of sanctions on the relationship between an advisor and a claimant far outweighs any potential positive impact. You're trying to build a supportive, trusting relationship, and you undermine that by referring somebody to have their benefits stopped.
Losses then, which I may be reprimanded for raising, but we have raised concerns in the past about, under universal credit, claimants who either refuse a 0-hour contract job or were on a 0-hour contract job, decided it wasn't for them, and then stopped that, could be sanctioned. So I'm just wondering if there's been any research being done on that, because it seems to me that that's counterproductive.
Well, this is a lot more vexed, I suppose, because the issues around does conditionality and sanctions work where people are out of work is a lot more complicated. The application of a sanction is a failure. That's when something's gone wrong. The relationship's gone wrong, often because of how the system has worked. Could be because of how the individual has behaved as well. So sanctions themselves should never be the objective. And the application of sanctions, there's a fairly substantial weight of evidence suggests that the negative impacts outweigh the positive ones in terms of insecurity, in terms of impacts on well-being and families and so on. Are conditional, what's in the international literature often called service and sanctions models for out of work to in work, more effective than non-conditional ones? The weight of evidence does suggest that service and sanctions models for job seekers, for people without health conditions and not lone parents, for example, are more effective than non-conditional systems. The 0 hours contract point, though, I would hope that shouldn't be happening, or it should only be happening in very exceptional cases, because the department has talked a lot about trying to improve the quality of the jobs they advertise and trying to screen on the quality of jobs in the new Find a Job service. So I'd be surprised if work coaches, in my view, should not be referring people to sanction for refusing a 0 hours contract job. I'd be surprised if the Find a Job service was advertising 0 hours contract jobs that didn't have a fair degree of security around the hours that we worked, for example, that didn't meet the thresholds.
Steve,
the short answer is I agree with Tony. I'd be very surprised in this context of in-work progression as well, specifically, if Tony made the point earlier about some people might need to step down to step up, but I'd be surprised if that was a 0 hours contract to be doing that stepping down before you step up, and I'd be surprised if there were sanctions around that. And I do think that the real point around all of the sanctions stuff is that conditionality is one thing, sanctions is another. We should be trying to avoid it, and we should be joining up those services around the quality of work as well. Taylor report that the Prime Minister commissioned and the government responded to last year, I think. So we need that much more wholesome way to work with employers as well as to work with individuals.
We're still waiting for the bill, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Chris?
Thank you, but there is another bill in my name, Frank, which I recommend, which is even better. So, Tony, turning to the point that you'd made, which I think I just want to explore, is the help and assistance they get in the role of the work coach in Job Centre Plus. Do you think that Job Centre Plus is the right organisation to deliver an in-work progression service?
So as I said, I'm in principle sort of fairly agnostic about who delivers, and I think I would say Job Centre Plus over the years, and variations of it, Employment Service before, has done some of this stuff, similar stuff really well. I mean, it was Job Centre Plus advisors who ran the Employment Retention Advancement Project, New Deal for Lone Parents, Action Teams for Jobs, various other things. As things stand now, I think it would be very, very hard for them to do it. You know, universal credit caseloads, 280 claimants per advisor. It's hard to see how you could deliver a really intensive, sort of personalised service with those sorts of caseloads. And I would have some concerns about some of the issues that the NAO raised actually in their recent reports about how, for example, about the lack of measures of customer satisfaction, the lack of measures on service quality, the lack of oversight centrally around how discretion is applied by advisors. There's a bit of a black hole in terms of what's actually being delivered and how it's being delivered. I would also say I think there are specific things that Job Centre Plus is not well placed to do. So you might have, so you could imagine contracting out the whole thing, or you could also imagine, I think, having a mixed economy. One of the things they really would not be well placed to do is some of that outreach and engagement and effective working with individuals who would just simply would not volunteer if they got an equivalent letter to the one Stephen was describing from Job Centre Plus, rather than from their social landlord or indeed from a community partner. And some really good examples of this. In the Step Up pilot, for example, the Indo-American Migrant and Refugee Organisation was one of the delivery organisations working with Latin American cleaners mostly around Elephant and Castle, who they had really good links with, and they did a lot of employment rights work with, and saying, helped with employment rights, it's now also helped you find a better job. You know, degree-educated people working in cleaning and helping them to progress. Things like that, Job Centre Plus would really struggle to do. I would also argue they struggle to do the employer-facing stuff, which would be good to sort of touch on, because I think how you work with employers to think about job design, about their HR models, and about their needs and about how they can develop their staff. There are far better organisations than Job Centre Plus to do that, and better to just work with them rather than try and duplicate that within Job Centre Plus.
I don't think Job Centre Plus should be the sole or main organisation doing this, but partly because I don't think there's enough work coaches given all of the other pressures that they've got and all of the other things that are being asked of them. Second, because I think you need a different skill set. There are related skills and capabilities, but it's a different skill set to work with people in low-paid work and with the employers in particular as well. And third, because I think that the point around how you engage people in an offer points towards housing associations, local authorities, community groups, a whole bunch of others as well. So I think for all those reasons, we need a much broader and different focus to this as a positive offer rather than a sort of condition of benefit thing. But the way to prove this one way or the other is to test it. And we've got a test, the RCT that we talked about for Job Centre Plus doing it. Let's have this. We've done a number of research and evaluations, some of which I and Tony have referred to, on a smaller scale to get local authorities in the voluntary sector to do it. Let's do the same level of RCT for whether housing associations and local authorities can deliver better results than the DWP RCT did.
Because obviously the trade unions have raised similar concerns that you'd raised there about whether the work coaches will have the time, because of their increased workload as a result of universal credit. So is that something that your organisation has looked at, or?
Well, I think whoever runs any form of service, whatever it looks like, you can't do it on the cheap. You have to invest.
Very good
well,
results.
That's a fair point. If you want to do it well, you can't do it on the cheap, and you have to invest in the right number of people and in the learning and skills and training for those people as well. And I think there are concerns that have been raised. You mentioned trades unions, but others, and it pops up in the various NAO reports as well about the number of things that are being asked of work coaches, whilst we're also rationalising the Job Centre Plus, or the government's rationalising the Job Centre Plus estate, and lots of other things are going on. And therefore, with the volume of people we're talking about who could potentially be caught in the net of in-work conditionality here, that's going to need a significant expansion, I would argue, of work coaches and investment in those work coaches if Job Centre Plus are going to do it. So, but I would say in any case, we need to do lots of that investment, but in any case, we need to be looking at that more engaging way through local authorities, housing associations and others.
Very good. Stephen, you mentioned local authority success here, housing associations. Can we have the names of those so we can invite them to give us evidence? We might go and visit.
Yes, so the West London pilot that I mentioned, where the local authorities had written out to their in-work housing benefit claimants, they were the West.
Authority.
So it's about 5 or 6 local authorities in West London, so we can provide the details of that to the committee, and similarly with other community groups and housing associations involved in that as well. There's a number across the country, and one of the things we've done is to draw that together into what we've called a better work network, where people who are working to try and help people in low-paid work to get on or earn more or change their career or whatever, come together and share some of the evidence and experience on what works, what challenges they're facing, how it's been tackled somewhere else. And I do think, I talked about investment in work coach training amongst other things. I do think that sharing of best practice and examples between organisations and between individuals is really important. I'd like to see the department playing even more of a role in that, but in the meantime, we've stepped in with that Better Work Network.
Brilliant. Thank you both very, very much. Very, very helpful. Now, on the second session, the gallery has now become our witnesses. So, welcome you very, very much. Laura, might you begin by telling us who you are for the sake of the record, and we'll then go down with your colleagues.
Okay, hello, my name is Laura Dewar, and I'm a policy officer at Gingerbread, the charity for single-parent families.
Hello, I'm Amanda Faull. I'm the Partnership and Development Manager for Timewise. We are leading experts in flexible working and job design, and through women like us, we've been supporting women returners and women in work.
I'm Sharlene McGee. I'm Policy Manager at Leonard, Cheshire, a pan-disability charity. We operate across the UK with care services and also delivering employment support programmes.
Julia Waltham, I'm Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Working Families. We're the UK's work-life balance charity. One of the things we do is we provide free legal advice to parents and carers who are struggling with the demands of work, family and children, especially those on a low income and parents of disabled children.
Thank you. Nigel.
I suppose we can start with a nice open question of what do you think of the current approach taken by Job Centre Plus to in-work progression? Should we start, Laura? Do you want to?
Well, we're just at Gingerbread. We want single parents to get the best jobs that they can, and we've got a history in talking about increasing skills for single parents, and so it's at the forefront of our. We want single parents to get the best job that they can, but also we want to recognise that they also care for children, and we want that taken into account. We're just starting a project looking in more detail about in-work progression and what that looks like, because I think from quite a lot of the evidence that Job Centre Plus are producing and the reports, they're rather general, and although there are a couple of projects that have included single parents, we think that there needs to be a greater understanding of the current background evidence and research, which finds that as a subgroup, single parents are on average much more likely to not progress, and that there are a number of characteristics that mean that they're less likely to progress. And I don't think Job Centre Plus or any assessment of the service can really do anything concrete until they look at those. I think just a generalist approach to single parents is not going to work.
Timewise have been working with the department on some of the in-work pilots, specifically looking at mothers and lone parents, those who require flexible working part-time, and how we can support them to progress. And from our experience and the feedback from the cohorts is that the support from Job Centre Plus around how they progress into better quality flexible jobs, so those that are 20k full-time equivalent, is a bit patchy. They still come to Timewise because they need more bespoke support in terms of navigating the career pathways for flexible working, and we understand that they need a lot more kind of wrap-around attention about their needs balancing against their caring responsibilities. So we know that there's still some improvement in terms of the more bespoke support needed for parents. And again, kind of addressing the reality of facing many of these women who are lone parents, is that they've built a world around them that works, as you was described earlier, and it's asking them to take a giant leap, and so they need a lot more care and focus about what a flexible career pathway might be for them.
I think we do have some real concerns when it comes to the ability and capacity, really, of work coaches and the kind of Job Centre Plus, in terms of really starting that meaningful conversation about aspirations for disabled people, about where they want to be and how to overcome the barriers that they've found perhaps from an early age, at kind of earlier stages of the employment journey, at kind of education and training level, and how those are carried on, and have an impact later on in life as well. In terms of what works, we do know from our programmes that confidence building, enabling disabled people to really carry out that brokering that they need to do with an employer when it comes to accessing their rights and entitlements in the workplace. Those are the things that we know that specialist organisations, when it comes to disabled people, that they're in a better place to be able to do and have the kind of individualised support that is needed.
You said at the beginning you had very real concerns. Have you got a case study you could just describe to us where it just went belly up?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of speaking, I guess, more anecdotally, when it comes to the clients that we have who are claimants, the kind of patchy support really is the main thing when it comes to how the administrative failings that there are, but also really when it comes to the kind of issues when it, in terms of accessing the claimant's entitlements, but also being able to have that confidence when it comes to engaging with universal credit. I think those gaps do still exist, but certainly from our advisors, that's what they would report back. But that's more of a kind of broad stroke, I guess.
Hi. So I think from our experience advising parents and carers, there's a huge sense of, so echoing what Tony said in the first session, of lack of understanding about conditionality and how moving on to universal credit will affect their situation. As has already been said, the kind of quality of support from job coaches is very patchy. In some cases you have a lot of recognition about people's responsibilities outside of work, and in other cases a very kind of tick box, these are the number of hours you need to do, kind of regardless of that person's personal situation. We've spoken to parents that they've been put under...
Is that how the target's set? You now need to do those number of hours? You've got examples of that, have you?
There are concessions within universal credit for parents with, children that are 3 to 4, or parents where their child is over 5. But parents aren't clear about that, and in some cases, work coaches can be unclear as well. Some parents, might feel under pressure where they shouldn't be put under pressure, and that kind of thing. But I think... Sharlene also talked about people's aspirations, and when I talk about patchy, we've had cases where parents are really kind of talked through, their situation, what their aspirations are, the training that they might want to do, they might want to move into social work or nursing. In other cases, that kind of hasn't been discussed at all, so there's a real kind of lack of consistency is what we've picked up.
A department a right to be engaged in work progression, or do you think it's just something they should leave alone?
Shall I? I think that kind of what really struck me in the first session is that you know, progressing in work is something that, you know, everyone, I suppose, would aspire to. But we at Working Families would argue that the infrastructure around people to progress in work just isn't there, and is actually that infrastructure can be really, really prohibitive. So I think we should talk about in-work progression, but we can't talk about it without addressing some of those really fundamental kind of structural problems and issues with the labour market, issues around childcare, you know, underlying issues around the fact that work just doesn't pay anymore, that don't support its actually work in practice.
All departments engaged that we should look at, not whether. Anybody disagree and just say, just leave this well alone, it's not your job. That's not what...
I think, I mean, like I say, at Gingerbread, we've looked at the experience of single parents, and I think some of the figures around people getting stuck in low-paid work is quite depressing. So a single parent is twice as likely to stay stuck in low pay than the partner in a couple. So, and also this thing about people not using their skills. I think Timewise have done some, you know, excellent work on looking at the gap between people's qualifications and the jobs that they get, and I think that is quite. I think that probably is something that needs to be addressed, but I think it probably needs to be addressed in a broader issue than to do with the individual. And I know that Bez is another government department is looking at opening up quality. Looking at job advertising and when jobs are advertised and really opening up part-time jobs. And I think issues around that and the broader issues in helping people use their skills is really important. And one thing I'm quite excited about is a concession that Gingerbread helps secure around people whose children are 3 and 4 who are asked to look for work under universal credit. And they can have their job seeking switched off for a year, and they can increase their skills and training. I think that's really exciting. I think getting people on a good pathway to work is really important. So I think as an organisation, yes, we want single parents to make the most of their skills, to increase their skills and not be stuck in low pay, but that not be around conditionality and sanctioning them for not doing so.
You'd work with some people who were part of the department's past pilots, was that right? Can you just talk us through that's what the claimant experience of being part of those.
Okay, so Timewise ran 2 pilots on behalf of DWP, but we have also over the last 2 years been commissioned, similar to what Tony said, with local authorities in London, specifically looking at BAME communities and the needs for women, particularly lone parents, what they need to progress in work. So again, the claimants that we were working with were often single mothers, juggling between work and caring responsibilities, trapped in low pay, and as Laura's just mentioned, not necessarily because they're not skilled or have the experience, but these are the only jobs that they can find that fit around their caring responsibilities. They're local. In the case with the BAME communities, they often use informal networks for childcare, and that is largely to do with trust, which was something unique to that pilot. We found that trust was a huge issue for these communities, particularly around the outreach. As Tony mentioned, we had to do a lot of community outreach. Some of our advisors actually went to the markets where particularly Somali women spend a lot of their time, and it was about engaging with the community, working with, we created parental ambassadors, so individuals from the community who could bring others along. We also found the trust issue around why do you want our data? So I can see a challenge about engaging with the Job Centre Plus and whether working with local community groups and partners as a collaboration is a better approach. But one of the challenges we also found is, and through the work that Timewise does with employers, is that we do know that there are too few better quality flexible jobs as you look up in organizations. And we estimate that there's about 1.5 million people who are trapped in low-pay, part-time, flexible jobs. And again, it's not necessarily because they don't have the experience. Just to give an example of some of the individuals that we helped, one woman was working on the shop floor at Sainsbury's. She had a finance and HR degree, and she accepted that role because she needed the shifts to work around her caring responsibilities. Through the pilot, we were able to help her build the confidence and apply for an HR officer role. And within a year of working in that position, she demonstrated that she was so good at the role that she was able to apply for another role as an HR manager position with another organization. So that was another learning from the pilot, that also it's not a one-step process. So going back to the concerns about the commitment and how you continue engaging with individuals, is that it was actually 2 stages for her to eventually move into the role that she was, that matched her ambitions. So it's about really building a connection with the individual, and it's much more bespoke and wrapped around their needs. And on the other side, what our advisors also, part of our service was to broker the conversations with employers, because as we know from our annual job index, is that only 1 in 10 jobs are advertised as being flexible or part-time, high-quality flexible jobs. So there's
What lessons do you think Sainsbury's should draw from the example you've given us?
So we've actually worked...
Obviously, they've spent less time trying to take over other firms, but apart from that...
well, we did actually pilot work in the retail sector as one of the DWP pilots, and we also are working with, we've worked with 5 major retailers, including Tesco, about how they can unlock flexible roles above the shop floor. And I think it is recognising the talent that you have at the bottom, that there is a lot more skills and opportunities that you're underutilising. But the challenge is when you start moving up the ladder, these jobs are designed full-time, and they are, in some cases, 24/7. So there's a huge lack of investment in job design pilots, and this is something that we're trialling, not just in retail, but other sectors, where there is an ambition to improve gender diversity, to grow their own talent. But we're piloting and testing this at the moment, but there's a huge opportunity to invest in those. And we're actually speaking with the department around some of these trials.
Aren't you letting Sainsbury off? In the sense that there's all the world of difference between them not recognising your skills that you have, and you're just doing a very ordinary job in the firm, in the shop. There are lots of other more important jobs, more better paid jobs in a store, where clearly they never even thought about that for this person you cite. So I'm trying to bring out, don't employers have a role in this? It's not just the government.
And I think there is work to be done in speaking at the top for the senior leadership to recognise what they're not currently achieving with their talent, but also the challenge is that the individuals I'm talking about need the flexible working and part-time, and as they go up the organisation. So assistant manager will be done at full-time. And so it takes more investment from the employer to understand how that job could be done differently, and also how to manage a more flexible team. So there is a role for the employer to recognise, but these are also very low-margin industries as well, and so
Can I bring in Ruth here, because Ruth's experience in Usbill.
Yes, so I've worked with all the major retailers for many years to try and persuade them to make their more junior management roles flexible. And I mean, they certainly for many years have insisted that even to go on the training programme you need to be able to give 24/7 flexibility, even to move up from an hourly or just above the minimum wage job onto annualised pay scales. And that hasn't changed an awful lot. So my question would be, I mean, to all of you, are employers ready for in-work conditionality? Because to be quite honest, if employers aren't ready to give the sort of employment that that the DWP are trying to force people into, is it fair to leave individuals stock between the demands of the job centre and the intractability of employers.
Because this is actually such a big question. Might I park that for a moment? Because it's very, very important, because it's interrupting Nigel's line of development. Nigel?
I'd happy to let you answer the question, really. I suppose, Amanda, when you were doing those trials, was there resistance from people to wanting to engage with this, or were people generally quite keen with the idea that they wanted to progress in work and they did want the support?
I think it was mixed. I think talking again about how they've really created a world that works for them, whether they were using their full experience or meeting their ambitions, we know that that wasn't the case. And it's about also advising them that this is possible. So in the example of Sainsbury's, she needed a part-time HR finance role, and there are so few of those jobs available. Our coaches were also able to broker those conversations with employers to show that this is something that could be possible. I think the kind of recognizing the BAME communities, and also, and this isn't isolated to the BAME communities, that although individuals are in work, they're lacking a lot of the employability skills, lacking some of the confidence, and also some had experienced prejudice and discrimination, or they needed to work in roles that fit around cultural considerations. So all of these challenges can be quite dissuasive, and so coaches did have to engage much more with the communities and, as I said, the individuals that could help bring them along. So it's not for a want of progression, it's about seeing what is possible.
Can I just mention something about hours? Because Julia touched earlier on the conditionality that's expected of people who are single parents or main carers in a couple. That I sort of think that is also, I don't quite know where the hours were sort of plucked out of. So there were 16 hours if you've got a child aged 3 and 4, and it's gone up to 25 hours now if your child is 5 and over. And I think in terms of sort of expectation, I think employers have a very low understanding of that increase in hours, the expectation. But also, the DWP run a find a job service, used to be called Universal Job Match. There's actually no search engine on that for looking for jobs for 16 hours or 25 hours. So you've got a conditionality regime that's pushed up the hours that people are expected to work on what is seen as a reasonable condition of them getting a benefit, with no joined up thinking as to actually whether those jobs exist. And I think I know you sort of wanted an evidence about what the department should be looking for. I don't think you can create a conditionality regime of hours or jobs if those jobs don't exist, or unless you're going to help those jobs to exist in working with employers and thinking how that can be done.
Sharlene?
Yes, I think certainly when it comes to job design, that's really important. And also where we have 83% of people who are disabled will develop the disability in work. And research from Leonard Cheshire has shown that 73% of disabled people have fallen out of work due to their disability. We know that by 2030 we'll have markedly more people living with conditions, health conditions, and so it's just about making a system that actually is fit for purpose and allows people to engage with an inclusive and fair workplace. The issue I think that Amanda brought up about recruitment, I think, is really pertinent when it comes to this. Really getting back into work then for people with fluctuating conditions, because their circumstances will change often, and where employers are certainly dissuaded from making the recruitment process completely accessible. For them, there is a certain perception that there's a cost implication there, and I think that that's across the board. That's shared both by employers who are more likely to employ disabled people and those who aren't. So I think there still is that case to be made in terms of the business benefits and ensuring that the investment that goes into a person who can be at quite an advanced stage of their career, that the devastating crisis point that it ends up being often when they do develop a disability in work. The fact that, in terms of identity, but also really everything that they've been contributing and their sense of purpose, really, that is massively affected. So I think all of that really has to be taken into consideration.
And just pick up on a couple of points, one around employers. So the qualitative research, the randomised control trial piece, identified that where employers have people on a permanent contract, they're more likely to progress in work. So I just wonder if this whole, the kind of proliferation of insecure employment contracts in the country will undermine any attempts for the government to progress people in work through universal credit, because, taking a very simplistic perspective, if you're on a contract where an employer can kind of fire you at will, progressing in work just seems, it just doesn't marry up. So we've been calling for a presumption kind of towards permanent employment status. And we think the government can drive that with employers, and we think that would support universal credit. But just to pick up on this thing about the labour market, so there's an acute shortage of quality part-time or otherwise flexible vacancies. It's already been picked up on. Laura talked about the Find a Job website. I went on there yesterday. At the moment, there's 24,000 IT vacancies. Under 4,000 are for permanent part-time jobs, so that's 15%. And of these, just 4% were for a salary of over £20,000. So it's just my kind of big point that I want to make is just that the infrastructure isn't in place to properly support the government's premise, really, I suppose. And the government, it does need to be more joined up in its thinking. I don't know if you know that BEIS has established a flexible working task force. Working Families is a member of that. It's been promoting the DWP's own Happy to Talk flexible working strapline and logo. I just wonder if there's more that the people that are thinking about in-work progression could do to join up with that. Again, kind of bringing in employers.
Do all government departments already implement that policy?
I think they're trying to. I definitely don't think that's been ignored. Probably not, but I think they're trying to. But I can have a look and let you know. I think they're trying to. Yeah, I think there's government civil services part of the task force, and I think there's acknowledgement they need to get their own house in order before they go out and tell employers to do it. But the only other thing I wanted to say was that in October, the Business Secretary, and Laura's touched on this, announced that the government's considering a duty on employers to consider if all roles can be done flexibly and to advertise them as such. I think it would be really good to look into the impact that might have on the labour market and whether or not it enables universal credit or in-work progression in universal credit to work better, whether or not it will do that. Because in my head it will, but I just wonder if looking at that properly would be helpful.
Can I just mention as well that in the pilots that there have been about people progressing in work, it very often means that they have to change jobs in order to progress, and what a risk that currently is for people who've secured flexible work. And the current legislation means that you've got to be in work for 6 months before you can request flexible working. So it's really a really significant risk for people to give that up to move jobs.
That myself. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. So just talking about barriers then, what help do different claimant groups need to overcome the barriers to progressing in work? Julia?
Well, I've already touched on some of them. So obviously I'm thinking about parents and carers. They need a they need to be able to look for work or part-time work, particularly, that's not just low-paid and low-skilled. That would help them progress in work. I want to talk about childcare as well. That's a significant barrier to parents being able to get into and progress in work. Under universal credit at the moment, it's paid in arrears, it's capped, not all of the cost of childcare is covered, and parents are required to constantly kind of verify the childcare and the pattern that they're using and how much that costs. Upfront monthly fees can be as much as £1,500 in some parts of the country, so parents are getting themselves into debt to try and cover that. So we're arguing that the government needs to develop a clear pathway for support for parents to meet kind of upfront childcare costs, potentially through reforming the Flexible Support Fund or the universal credit advances. But more broadly, we need a childcare system where work pays, because again, I would argue that we don't have that at the moment will fatally undermine this in-work progression in universal credit working. And so childcare is a barrier that needs to be overcome. The problems around the labour market, I would argue that more and more insecure employment contracts will, that needs to be overcome in some way for people to progress in work. There's another element of universal credit which we also have an issue with, which is that, I don't know if you know, but one parent in a couple household is designated as the responsible carer. And, where the government on one hand is really making an effort to encourage families to share care, to encourage women and men to share care equally, in another area, it's forcing couples to choose who works and who stays at home. And that's, that really should be looked at, because it's just contradictory, in my view. So that's another barrier. And then, finally, work isn't paying for families. They talked in the first session, and I'm not an expert, but, there's a huge amount of families now that are living in poverty where at least one person is working. And again, I would argue that that's a structural, fundamental challenge to this concept of progressive. The government's premise is that people will get a job, get out of poverty, but actually if you have a situation now in this country where people are working a 35-hour week and they are still in poverty. And then, very, very final thing I would say is that, people want to have choice over the amount of time they spend with their family and over the amount of time they spend working. And the government needs to be really careful that this kind of working more hours at all costs approach doesn't undermine family resilience and lead to problems elsewhere for families.
One of the other barriers, one of the other barriers then, Julie, would surely be people who don't have contracts which guarantee their hours from a day-to-day or weekly basis. Do we have sectors of the economy that, as you've touched on in terms of childcare, where people turn up at work?
I think that's really problematic for families, because actually what parents need flexibility, but they need permanent. So I think they need permanent jobs with genuine flexibility within that. And what's happened for parents, I think insecure work contracts can work for some people, but for parents the flexibility is all one-sided, and actually, establishing a childcare pattern, you can't be done overnight. And actually what parents worry about is that if they can't fulfil the employer obligations of kind of working at the last minute, they'll be offered less work as a consequence. So I think that is a problem.
I think in terms of other barriers, one that I'd like to focus on is access to work. Our recent research had shown that there still are real gaps in terms of the awareness amongst employers and disabled people, and also the kind of coverage when it comes to the numbers of disabled people who are receiving support through access to work.
And I know this in my previous roles at trade union rep, it's employers trying to ignore or wriggle out of access to work recommendation?
Absolutely. It's still a recommendation, really, yes. I think that's the issue, certainly with it as a provision. But what our research found was that even where applications were successful, there still was a sizable proportion, I think it was 69% of successful applications that people were still having to wait for up to 3 months for that support to be put in place. So those kind of administrative massive gaps, really, how they jeopardise jobs and securing jobs and being able to remain doing the job that you're doing. I think that has to have attention. I think certainly another thing that our research showed was the disparity in terms of across the UK with access to work engagement. We had 23% of disabled people that we spoke to in England had engaged with access to work, and that fell to 10% in Northern Ireland and 14% in Wales and Scotland. So there's some issue there that I think really requires further examination about why that is. But where we see that funding has not gone up noticeably and the numbers of people who are affected also hasn't gone up noticeably, I think those are...
I echo quite a lot of what Julie has just said, but I think just to add to that, we also assume that people in work are work ready, and so one of the findings from our pilots is that they needed a lot of support in terms of in some cases English language skills, CVs, and so addressing that, but also again to echo, jobs also need to be people ready, and so going back to the point about our two-part support, where we're supporting that individual around their ambitions, but then also having those conversations with employers about how we can create jobs that work for them as well.
I just wanted to ask you, Amanda, because obviously myself and Julia touched on this in our exchange, is the deregulation of the labour market is such that people turn up to work and don't know what hours they're going to be doing that day. It's a very real issue. Just if there was any comment you had on that.
Where we work mainly is with the roles that I said are about above 20k full-time equivalent, and so it's about supporting people to progress out of the insecure work into better quality positions.
I think progression looks different for different stages of people's sort of working life, and I think there needs to be a more nuanced approach to that. I've already spoken about parents. The DWP themselves have recognised that group of parents are lower skilled and further from the job market. I think there has to be that more nuanced approach to improving skills for people and basic, some English language, some English maths skills, but also the pathways into what work kind of looks like for people and how they might use those skills. So I think basic skills pathways for people, how they can translate their skills, and sometimes they might have to step slightly sideways in the work that they do. But I agree the structural points around work are just so incredibly important, and childcare. I think there are elements of universal credit that work against in work progression. People are not necessarily better off in work.
Do you agree, if I put it this way, if you've got a young family, that requires great flexibility in your life, and what you therefore need is security from your employment to match your flexibility of managing your family. When you don't have a young family, you can take on a flexibility in the workplace which you could never do when you're already needing to be flexible looking after your children.
Yes, I agree.
No, it's just, but until you said it, I hadn't thought of it that way. That we thought I'd been thinking this flexibility in one dimension, but it actually, once you introduce the child care factor into it, nurturing your family, you're then beginning to see that there's a double flexibility you're requiring of families with children, or young children at least. Chris, sorry, I interrupted.
And I think also in having a more nuanced approach to progression, can't remember whether it was a Timewise project or what it was, but it actually looked at pinch points of when people might want to progress more. So say, for instance, when your children are older, when they're going to secondary school, maybe that's, that there are pinch points around progression that might be positive times. And that's where you might put more resource rather than saying to someone whose child is 5, who's maybe just moved into work of 16 hours, we think you should work 25. Is that the best? Is that the best point that you should be asking for that? Are there points that you could do it that would be more likely to succeed?
And I think it's that.
Yeah. Sorry, my next question will probably be a quick answer from all of you. You would have heard me asking it to the first panel. Is should conditionality and sanctions play any role at all in encouraging universal credit claimants to increase their pay and hours? Laura.
Who wants to lose their job?
No, exactly. I think it's an established thing here and internationally that there are conditions attached to receiving benefits. But I think conditionality should be seen as a broader issue of helping the country to use its skills and to progress people and be a growing economy, and that's what it should be about. And so I don't think giving a sanction to someone is already in the earlier session does not help. But I can see that you might have some conditions around someone who's in an out-of-work benefit to help them move into work. But as I say, I think broader issues of conditionality should be around using skills and helping the economy.
We don't think it's fair that parents with young children should face conditionality, and those who are, or fair to sanction parents who need to work flexibly, but as we already mentioned, there's a huge deficit of flexible jobs and opportunities to progress into. And also, I didn't mention earlier, and I think Tony might have mentioned, when we talk about a better quality job, it doesn't necessarily mean increased pay. For some of the feedback from the cohort that we worked with, it was about achieving a better work-life balance, more secure work, better able to manage their caring. So I think it's also considering that when you're thinking about sanctions for individuals and why they're not progressing.
Yeah, well, sanctions are a very blunt tool when it comes to the application of them on disabled people. I think particularly where there are kind of IT challenges, skills challenges, as well as a lack of discretion from work coaches in their application. I think that there is a fairness issue there, and the Equality and Human Rights Committee have, of course, spoken about that. And we know that they're being disproportionately applied to disabled people, and I think that is cause for concern. The ramifications of that on the well-being of disabled people and the kind of exacerbation of their conditions, that has to be brought into consideration.
Yeah.
So no, not for parents and carers. In our experience, through our legal advice service, where there are hours available for parents that work with their childcare, they will take them. It's as I've said, and probably bored you all to tears, it's the infrastructure around parents that is prohibitive. And for that reason, and the evidence from the randomised control trial, and the fact that Tony and Stephen were talking earlier about that, the drought of evidence that it actually works. In the randomised control trial, it actually just stresses people out. So no.
Now I'll say it out loud. I think a question allocated to Ruth has really been answered, but she has an experience as a senior trade union official of actually trying to win some of these changes, largely for women workers, because they've been in retail. And they're obviously, clearly, the retail sector is a very, very important area for what we've actually been talking about. So, Ruth, can you pose the question again and start a discussion there?
Thank you. Maybe I could just pose a few specifics first. I mean, particularly, Sharlene, around long-term health conditions and disability, because certainly retail employers have pretty strict sickness absence policies at the moment. You're not allowed more than 3 periods of sickness absence in any 6 months, and that can be just half a day. So it really, unless you've got a condition that fits within the Equalities Act, then you're really struggling. And we see a lot of problems for people with conditions where they will pass a work capability assessment, but they won't pass employers' very strict sickness absence policies. Do you find people running up against policies such as that?
Absolutely, yes. And people we speak to, the kind of rigid boxes that exist, and that's in kind of every sector, I would say. Certainly where they often find that maybe their line manager is a really good person who knows them well, and that they're able to communicate with them, but when it comes to being sent, kind of shunted elsewhere in the organisation, once they need to kind of seek further support, that's an issue for them. And, you know, there are massive consequences there when it comes to stifling disclosure and kind of having an open culture as well. And it's a very common thing for people to tell us about how they didn't want to be seen, even by their colleagues, to be getting an unfair advantage, and really a very hostile environment, which of course would exacerbate their condition for sure.
And are employers still asking in references from previous employers about an employee's sickness absence record? Because that's something that does often happen, whether it's formally or informally, that can count against people with long-term health conditions in particular, make it very difficult for them to get another job.
It's not something I've come across personally, but I can certainly seek advice elsewhere in the organisation and come back to you.
That would be really helpful, thank you. And just generally, I mean, my experience in retail was that more and more they were becoming very low hours jobs, and that actually the DWP has encouraged employers to see universal credit as a way to offer more low hours employment, that there aren't the ceilings around 16 hours and 24 hours anymore, that they're encouraged to offer mini jobs which people then have to flex up from. Is that, and then that obviously becomes a problem in that if you can't get your additional hours, you have to look for a different job, and that employer wants flexibility as well. Is this something that you've come up against?
Do you think the change was a good change? Because it sounds good, doesn't it, for a flexible labour market, abolishing those ceilings. Do you think that, looking back on it, is as Ruth's saying, is that a real success?
I will say I was quite concerned that the one issue that the DWP made sure they communicated to employers was around the ending of those thresholds on hours, to tell employers that it didn't matter for universal credit the number of hours that they offered, which doesn't fit with their message to claimants around in-work conditionality.
Conditionality. Yeah, I mean it's. I mean one of the things that we're doing a project in work progression, and I think increasingly looking at the evidence around certain sectors, they're just very, very poor for employing women. And one of the things that we really want to do at Gingerbread in our in-work progression work is to look at different routes in different sectors where there's a shortage of skills. Because I think you're going to come across in retail and in certain sectors that it's probably going to get worse, and those contracts are going to get worse. And I think there's a role for the DWP in talking about progression to people, to explaining to people about different jobs and different pay. And I know from our centenary work we did last year at Gingerbread, you know, a woman that we helped to secure flexible working, she worked Heathrow Express, used to sell tickets, a good boss, she talked to a good boss who said, why don't you become a train driver? This is the routes into it. She trains train drivers now. Now, if she was just selling tickets, the progression of selling tickets is not going to be very much, but thinking of different routes into very different jobs, I think, for single parents and people who are currently low skilled, I think you do a service to them in thinking about a broader range of jobs, and definitely for women a much broader range of better paid jobs.
But don't you think it's I mean, you need somebody to give you the confidence to say, I'm going to be a train driver. It's just like with teachers when they say to a pupil, you can do so much better, why don't you do this? And it's these magical moments, aren't there, which change people's lives. Do you think who should do that, Laura? And then I'll shut up and go down the panel.
Well, I think employers have got a role in that, but also employers have a bottom line. And I think one of the interesting points about the Pets at Home work that Timewise did was actually it was because the employers had a problem. So they kept on having managers leaving, their regional managers leaving, people on the shop floor really steady, employers, mostly women. And so employers have to have a bottom line. And assuming with train driving, it's because they've got a shortage of people who wanted to be train drivers and they want to, you know what I mean? It's employers they're not going to do it out of charity. They're going to do it because it helps their bottom line. But I suppose there's a role in organisations like Timewise or government to say this will help your bottom line in explaining it. And there have been pilots as well. I think a Scandinavian hotel that group, I don't know if that was a Timewise pilot, but they advertise their jobs internally and have a real sort of show real routes to progression, and they see that as a priority as opposed to going outside. So people have an ownership of staying in an organisation and progressing. And so there are some good practice examples, but I think employers have to be convinced that it's going to help their bottom line.
Could I just throw into this seasonal work, actually? I mean, you mentioned hotels and obviously the tourist trade, but retail as well, and catering are very seasonal. And the whole dialogue around in-work progression doesn't recognise that, and people actually get penalised when their hours drop significantly. On paper, anyway, I wondered if that was something that you'd come across as part of your work.
Just say that I agree. We've had people call our advice line who, you know, they're retailer. Actually, this person worked for a retailer, but wanted them to increase their hours over Christmas dramatically, and wanted her to do some evening shifts. Obviously, she had a young child. You know, as I said, my point is that parents value security, consistency with flexibility within that. And to kind of echo what's been said, line managers are really crucial in kind of delivering that. So I agree, really, is what there's a lot that's kind of mitigating against people having consistency and security and progression in work by the way the labour market is structured and its direction of travel.
And is the way that universal credit's set up that if you get a temporary increase in hours, such as over Christmas, it's then you lose 63% of it the next month. Are people aware of that? And they're being pushed to progress in work, thinking that it's a straight line progression, but if it's not, they do some extra hours and then their hours drop back. It's almost a double whammy afterwards, which you didn't get in tax credits. Because they were constant throughout the year. Is that an issue?
I raised evidence on universal credit, natural migration, that it's an issue for people taking a bit of temporary work, say like at Christmas, and then that tipping them over into going onto universal credit and it being less generous for them. So that definitely is an issue.
Just to say, is there anything else you'd want to add on the suitability of the preparedness of the employment market for the demands of universal credit? you've given quite a lot of evidence, but just if there's anything you wanted to add.
Laura said, we have worked in retail. Unfortunately, it's a contracting industry, so some of the work that we did with major retailers, they are implementing in some ways themselves. They are looking at how they can create a management route that allows people to progress from the shop floor, but retaining the flexibility. That does take investment in how those jobs are split, also some of the systems, and actually I think that's one of the biggest barriers at the moment for them is the technology around the shift management and the training of managers, and the kind of culture shift. So it's, again, kind of different store managers will approach it in different ways, and so the success is difficult to roll out across a major retailer. But we know from other sectors that we're beginning work with, so construction, for example, one of the drivers is around gender, and they recognise that a lot of women aren't attracted to the industry, but also when they are in the industry, they, if they want to return after childbirth, find it very difficult to design the work around part-time. So it's something that we're exploring with the sector. But it's kind of unknown in terms of how that will manage on site. So there's a lot of testing, a lot of need for more investment in how these jobs can be designed in these more frontline shift patterns.
If you end it there, you
it seems
presented
to be moving much slower than the pace of the universal credit rollout.
But you presented your knowledge in such a good way to us. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Thank you very much.